It was not a day meant for crowds. No trumpets. No shouts. No public proclamation. Just a quiet Monday morning in the northern city of Newcastle, when most were still in their beds, and the streets had not yet shaken off the sleep of the Sabbath. But on that morning, the 31st day of July, in the year 1592, a man was being dragged through those narrow, cobbled streets. His body was tied to a hurdle behind a horse. His face, bruised and scraped from the stones, had once been fair and young. He was 23 years old. No more. And his name was Joseph Lampton. He was not a criminal in the eyes of heaven. He had killed no man. He had stolen nothing. He had not betrayed a king. His only crime was to be a Catholic priest and to return to England at a time when that alone was considered treason. Joseph came from the north, from Durham, a land where the old faith still clung to the hills and hearths, despite the Queen's laws. He had left England young, sent to train for the priesthood at the English college in France, a place where exiled men of God prepared for a quiet war against a state that had declared their church illegal. He was ordained in March of the year 1592, 2 months before his time, by papal dispensation, and returned to England on the 22nd day of April. He was sent to minister to the souls of Westmoreland, not to raise armies, not to challenge the crown, but simply to offer the sacraments in secret, to hear confessions by candlelight, to say Mass behind the false walls of country houses. But Parliament had already passed a law declaring that any priest entering the realm without swearing loyalty to Queen Elizabeth within 3 days was a traitor, and traitors, in those days, were not merely killed. They were destroyed. He was caught before he had even reached his parish, arrested in Newcastle, held for trial, alongside another priest, Edward Watterson. They were young. They were quiet. They had no weapons, no allies, no hope of reprieve. They were sentenced swiftly, and the punishment was not hanging alone, for hanging was too merciful for those who defied the Church of England. Joseph Lampton was condemned to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, a sentence reserved for the vilest of enemies. And yet this man, this boy, had done nothing but pray. The authorities feared what his death might awaken. The north of England was restless, its memory still raw from rebellions against the crown's religious reforms. A public execution could rally sympathy, stir unrest, or worse, inspire martyrdom. And so, they altered the plan. Instead of executing him on a Saturday, in the full gaze of the people, they moved the date in secret to the morning of Monday. No public square, no gathering crowd, just a scaffold inside the city. The wood still damp with morning dew, and a handful of soldiers who knew better than to speak of what they were about to see. The journey to the scaffold was itself a torment, the hurdle scraped against the stone streets, each jolt sending pain through the bound limbs of the condemned. His body was already bloodied before the noose was ever placed around his neck. When they reached the gallows, the executioner moved quickly. A rope, a knot, a heave. Joseph dangled above the ground, his breath choking in his throat. And then, just before death claimed him, the rope was cut. His body fell. He gasped, not knowing if he still lived or was already halfway to heaven. But what happened next was something no one expected. The executioner stepped back, refused to go on, refused to finish the sentence. Whether from conscience, fear, or sudden conviction, he laid down his tools. Perhaps he believed the man before him was innocent. Perhaps he believed that continuing would damn his own soul. Perhaps he simply could not look into Joseph's eyes and see anything but a man of God. But the sentence had not been fulfilled. And so, The work was passed to another, not an Englishman, not a hangman, but a surgeon, a Frenchman, a man trained not for killing, but for cutting. He approached without ceremony, without pause. He took a blade. He laid Joseph upon the executioner's table, still gasping, perhaps still conscious, perhaps already beyond pain. He took a knife and severed the priest's genitals, threw them into the fire. Then he opened his belly, pulled forth the organs that had once belonged to a living, breathing man, burned them too. The fire hissed and spat as flesh and faith vanished into smoke. And still, it was not done. The Frenchman took an axe and struck the neck, cleanly or not, and lifted the head from the shoulders. And even then, it was not over. The corpse was quartered, limbs sliced, arranged, packed. The parts of the body were sent to different towns, warnings nailed to gates, meat for crows. But in a final act of horror, they brought the remains to the other priest. Edward Watterson showed him the head, the limbs, told him this was his future, told him to recant, or face the same. But Father Watterson looked at the bloodied flesh and saw not terror, but relics. He did not weep. He did not beg. He bowed his head, and he said nothing. And so, Joseph Lampton died in darkness, in silence, far from the chants of his church, far from his family, far from justice. He died with no one to witness, no one to mourn. But still, something in the air changed. In the following years, his name became a whisper among the faithful. His death became a symbol not of defeat, but of endurance. He had been 23, no more than a boy, and yet he died like a saint. Centurilateur. Long after the law had changed, and the church had returned in part to its rights, the Pope would look upon his name and say what England could not martyr. In the year 1987, Joseph Lampton was beatified, one of 85 martyrs of England and Wales. But even before Rome claimed him, the people who remembered him needed no declaration. They remembered the quiet Monday morning, the empty scaffold, the executioner who walked away, and the young man whose only weapon had been his faith and whose death, done in secret, it spoke louder than any sermon. Before the rope, before the blade, before the surgeon touched the flame, there was a boy in Durham, born not into war, not into wealth, but into the stubborn quiet of the North, a land of fog and flint and faith, where old bells still echoed beneath ruined abbeys, and grandmothers still made the sign of the cross in the way their mothers had taught them. Long before it became treason, he was not a rebel then. He was just Joseph. He grew up in a country that no longer recognized the God it once crowned. A country that had torn down its saints and nailed the walls shut on its sacristies. But still in secret, in whispers, in locked cellars and candlelit barns, the people prayed. His family was known, though not powerful, respected, but not safe. To be Catholic in the North was to walk a thin line between tradition and danger. There were raids, searches, questions asked too sweetly by men, with too many rings. But Joseph, from the very start, walked that line without fear. He was quiet, yes, but not cautious. There was something still in him, not passive, but patient like water in a stone basin, waiting for the light to return. They say he was gentle. They say he smiled easily. They say he listened more than he spoke. But when he did speak, people listened, because his voice carried the kind of weight that could not be taught. He left England, young, barely more than a boy, traveling across the Channel to the seminary in France, where exiled sons of England trained in secret to become priests for a land that no longer wanted them. The English college stood like a fortress of memory, filled with men who had left everything behind: names, titles, families, to serve the old faith in the country of their birth. They lived simply. They studied late. They prayed as if God were the only one still listening. And Joseph, young though he was, rose quickly, not because he sought power, but because he believed. Every lesson he took into his bones, every word he spoke as if it mattered. By the year 1592, the year that would end his life, Joseph was ordained early. Too early, by special permission. The church saw something in him, something urgent, something ready, and so they laid hands upon him in the Lateran Basilica. In March, with spring barely whispering through the city, and the bells rang out across the stone like they had for centuries before. He was not even 23. He was not supposed to be ordained for 2 more months. But Rome made an exception. And heaven, it seems, was in a hurry. He left France in April, not in secret, not in shame. He left as a man sent on a mission not to convert by fire, but to comfort by faith. He was assigned to Westmoreland, a place he knew by heart. He would move between houses under cover of night, bringing the sacraments to those who still waited in silence for God to come back to them. He would say Mass in hidden rooms, behind walls that were not walls, in priest holes carved by hands more skilled than honest. He would hear confessions whispered through cracks in floorboards. He would anoint the dying where no candles could be seen from the road. This was the war he had prepared for, not with weapons, but with water, with bread, with words. But the crown had grown sharper in the years since his childhood. In the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, to be a priest ordained abroad was to be a traitor. To wear a stole and speak the Latin Mass was to risk death by a sentence so brutal that even executioners looked away. Parliament had passed a law not long before he returned. Any priest entering the kingdom was to present himself before a justice of the peace within 3 days and swear loyalty to the Queen as the head of the church. A refusal meant death. And for a Catholic priest, there was no other answer. They would rather die than kneel to a crown that had turned its back on Rome. Joseph knew the risk. He accepted it. He stepped ashore in England in late April, and by early summer, he was caught. Some say it was betrayal. Some say it was bad luck. Some say he never had a chance. He was arrested in Newcastle, brought before a magistrate. No defense. No appeal. He was what they said he was, a priest. And for that, he would die. He was not the first. He would not be the last. But he would be one of the youngest. And there was something about his face too young, too calm, that made even the jailers uneasy. They say he did not speak much in prison. He did not protest. He did not beg. He simply waited, and while he waited, the date of his death shifted. First they planned for Saturday, a public hanging, à leçon. But someone changed their mind. The city was too Catholic. The people might intervene. There might be trouble. There might be mercy. And so, they moved it to a Monday, just after dawn. In the chapters to come, we will walk those final miles, with him dragged behind a horse on a hurdle through the sleeping streets, through stones that bruised his face, past houses that once sheltered men like him, toward a scaffold built not to punish, but to erase. But before we go there, before we hear the fire hiss, or feel the blade fall, let us pause with the boy who once dreamed not of martyrdom, but of ministry, who crossed the sea not to fight, but to serve, who came home with nothing in his hands but faith, and gave it without resistance, without pride, to a country that repaid him with a noose, a knife, and a fire that did not burn clean, because to understand his death, we must first remember his silence, and the way he walked toward it without once looking away. To understand the scaffold, one must first understand the law that built it, not law carved in marble, not law delivered by angels, but law written in fear, sharpened in ink, and signed by men whose robes dragged through blood as easily as they did through dust. The England that Joseph Lampton returned to in the spring of the year 1592 was not a kingdom of peace. Not truly. Though the wars had paused and the banners no longer flapped in open rebellion, it was a place held together by silence, suspicion, and statutes that made belief, a blade aimed at one's own neck. Queen Elizabeth I had ruled for over 3 decades by that time. And though her throne no longer trembled, as it had in the days when Mary of Scots still lived, it was not yet steady, and her crown still sat uneasily upon a head that had once knelt before Latin Mass, but now presided over the Church of England, with a scepter in one hand and a noose in the other. It was not just treason to act against the Queen, it was treason to believe against her, to think in Latin, to carry a rosary, to open one's mouth, to say Mass in a language older than her laws, and it was treason most of all to be a priest, not bred under her eye, but ordained on the continent, trained by Rome, and returned with oil still wet on the fingers. Parliament, with her blessing, had passed act after act that turned the cross into contraband, and the stole into a weapon, and in the cold corridors of power, where courtiers whispered and spymasters listened, it was decided that the only way to keep England safe was to make sure every Catholic within its borders was either silent, invisible, or dead. And so they wrote laws not to govern, but to trap, to catch a man in the space between confession and communion, to hang him by the thread of his conscience and call it justice. By the time Joseph Lampton stepped off the ship that carried him home, it had already been declared that any priest entering England must present himself to a justice of the peace within 3 days, and swear the oath of supremacy, a declaration that the Queen, and not the Pope, was the supreme governor of the Church in England. To refuse was treason, and for a Catholic priest, refusal was the only option. For to take the oath was to deny the very authority that had ordained him, to spit on the hands that had blessed him, to burn the very book he carried hidden in the folds of his robe. There was no mercy in the law, and no ambiguity. He was not tried for murder. He was not tried for conspiracy. He was not caught with weapons or money or sedition. He was caught with a collar and a name. And that was enough. They arrested him in Newcastle, quickly, quietly. They knew what he was. He did not resist. He did not run. Perhaps he had known this would happen. Perhaps he had planned only to serve a few months, a few weeks, before being captured. Perhaps he thought there might be time to slip through the nets. But the nets were everywhere, and the fishermen were paid in blood. He was imprisoned, questioned, and sentenced all within the space of a season. There was no lengthy trial, no theater of justice. He stood before a judge, and the law was read, and the sentence was given to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The punishment reserved for traitors, for those who betrayed the crown not with sword or rebellion, but with silence and sacrament. But even then, there was fear not from the priest, but from the state. The authorities in Newcastle knew that the North remained a land of ghosts and loyalty, that the old faith still whispered in the walls and behind the hedgerows, that to kill a priest publicly might draw a crowd, not of jeering citizens, but of those who remembered the pilgrimage of grace, the rising of the earls, the days when the North marched against the changes made by Henry VIII and had been drowned in fire and gallows for it. They feared a crowd might not watch, but intervene, that the scaffold might become a pulpit, that the priest might speak and awaken something they had worked too hard to keep asleep. And so they made a decision. They moved the execution to a Monday, before dawn, in a quiet square where no one would gather, where the birds would outnumber the people. The plan, at first, had been to kill him on a Saturday, a spectacle, a warning, but they changed it. Not for mercy, but for control. They would kill him before the city could wake, before the bells could ring, before the candles could be lit. They would kill him in silence, and then say nothing. They separated him from the other priest, Edward Watterson, whose own fate hung in the balance, suspended by hesitation and hope. Watterson was given a delay, a chance to recant, to swear the oath, to live, and for a moment, it seemed he might. But Joseph was given no such chance. They did not wait for him. They did not plead. They condemned him fully, swiftly, without hesitation, perhaps because he had shown no hesitation himself. The day before his death, he was moved to a smaller cell, closer to the scaffold. He was not told the hour. He was not allowed to say Mass. He was not given a final confession, though perhaps someone, in secret, came to him, a guard with trembling hands, a fellow prisoner with whispered words. No one recorded his last thoughts. No one painted his final portrait. He would die as he had lived, quietly, faithfully, invisibly to the world that had condemned him. In the next chapter, we will walk beside him, not yet to the gallows, not yet to the fire, but to the edge of his last night. We will listen for the sound of chains in the dark. We will feel the cold seep through the stone. We will hear the breath of a man who knows that morning will bring not light, but knives. But before we go there, let us linger in this moment when the sentence has been passed, but not yet carried out, when the law has spoken, but not yet swallowed him, when the priest still breathes, still prays, still hopes not for reprieve, but for strength. Let us remember what it means to be declared a traitor, not for betrayal, but for belief, not for weapons raised, but for sacraments offered, not for what he did, but for what he would not say. Because in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, silence itself could be considered sedition, and in the mouth of a priest, even a whispered prayer was dangerous enough to demand dismemberment. And so, a boy of 23 waited in a stone cell for the sentence to begin, not just his, but the sentence of a nation that could no longer distinguish between danger and devotion, and had decided to kill both. And somewhere, beyond the cell, the scaffold waited, and the city, still asleep, did not yet know what it was about to lose. The night before his execution passed without thunder, without omen, without any sign from heaven or earth that something sacred was about to be undone. The city slept. Newcastle's rooftops held the last of the summer heat. And somewhere, not far from the prison walls, dogs barked once, then were silent. It was the kind of night that left no trace, no wind, no moonlight, only the slow, steady march of time, slipping unnoticed through the cracks in the stone. And in a small, dark cell, A boy barely turned priest lay awake, his hands bound, his feet blistered from days in chains, his lips moving in silent prayer, not for salvation, not for a miracle, but for the strength to die well. Joseph Lampton had no priest beside him for confession, no crucifix on the wall, no holy oils, no choir to carry his soul in chant. He had only what he brought with him: his training, his courage, his silence. Perhaps he had memorized the Psalms. And now, in that final darkness, he whispered them back to the God who had made him a servant and was now calling him home. Perhaps he thought of his family, his father, his mother, the brothers he had left behind in Durham, who would never see his face again, and who might never even know where his bones had been buried, or if they had been buried at all. Perhaps he thought of the stone halls in France, of the smell of candles in the chapel where he had been ordained early. Too early, because someone in Rome believed his life would be short. But perhaps he did not think of anything. Perhaps he simply waited, because waiting was all that remained. The execution had been scheduled for early Monday, before sunrise, before the city stirred, before the church bells could ring, before the faithful could wake and raise their voices in protest or in prayer. The crown feared a crowd. It feared the old women who remembered Latin Mass. It feared the young men who might throw stones. It feared that this priest, like others before him, might die too well with dignity, with grace, and in dying, plant seeds of rebellion that would not stay buried. And so it chose the hour carefully, the hour when even the watchmen yawned, when the milk carts had not yet rolled, when the world was quiet enough to kill a man without leaving a sound behind. They came for him before the sun rose. 3 guards. No speech. No threat. No explanation. Just keys in a lock. The scrape of metal against stone. The sudden weight of their hands on his shoulders. He stood without resistance. His legs were unsteady. Not from fear, but from exhaustion. They had kept him in irons for days, and the skin at his ankles had broken. But still he walked, not with pride, not with shame, just with the quiet strength of someone who had long ago stopped hoping for mercy. They bound his wrists again, not roughly, mechanically, as if tying a sack of grain. They did not look him in the eye. They led him through the corridors, down the stairwell, into the open air. And then the city opened up before him, dark, damp, shrouded in mist. There was no crowd, just a few figures in the distance. A constable, a magistrate, a priest of the crown. Perhaps. Though no blessing was offered, no one spoke. Even the horse that waited to drag him seemed half asleep. They tied his body to the hurdle, a wooden frame, used to carry criminals to the scaffold in a way that made certain their death began long before the rope. He was lashed down. Face up or face down no longer matters. Because the streets were unforgiving, the stone tore into his flesh with each jolt, and the journey, though short in distance, was endless in pain. The horse walked, the hurdle scraped, and the silence held. There were lights in windows, flickers of waking life, but no one stepped outside. The people knew. Someone had whispered it. The boy priest, the one from Durham, the one they caught too soon. And they knew what happened to men like him. They knew how it ended, but they did not know it would happen like this. So early, so hidden, so afraid. The scaffold had been prepared the night before, raised in a square off town moor. Not in the center of the market, not in the shadow of the cathedral, but in a place chosen for its quiet, a place where blood would not be seen by too many eyes. The gallows stood, already creaking, The rope had been tested. The executioner was there. But what no one expected was what would follow. They brought him to the platform, untied him, helped him stand. He was shaking now, not from fear, but from pain. His skin had been opened by the stones. His joints ached, and his breath was shallow. He was 23 years old, and he looked not like a traitor, not like a martyr, but like a boy who had never been allowed to grow old. The executioner took the rope, tied it, threw it over. Joseph did not resist. They hoisted him. The noose tightened. His feet lifted from the earth. He kicked once, twice, and then fell still. But this was only the beginning, because the sentence was not hanging. It was hanging, drawing, and quartering. He was to be revived. He was to be brought back from the brink, so that the real punishment could begin. But the man holding the rope, the executioner, stepped back. He looked at the boy, and he refused. No one moved. No one spoke. The executioner said only that he could not go on, that he would not, that this was not justice. And so the crown found another. Not an Englishman, not a hangman, but a surgeon, a Frenchman, a man trained in the art of cutting. And what followed cannot be called execution, only butchery. He approached the body, perhaps still alive, still conscious, still trembling at the edge of death. He took a knife. He severed the genitals and threw them into fire. He cut open the belly, removed the organs, burned them too. He took the axe. He struck the neck, severed the head, and then, with methodical precision, he divided the limbs. And when it was done, the pieces were wrapped, not for burial, but for warning. Some were sent to gates, some to bridges, but the head was brought to another man, Father Edward Watterson, still imprisoned, still waiting. They showed it to him, told him to look, told him this would be his fate. They expected fear, but he did not flinch. He looked at the flesh and saw relics, not ruin, holiness, not aurora. And he prayed. And so Joseph Lampton died, not once, but many times, in many places, in many pieces. And still, no bell was rung, no mass was said, no grave was dug. Only the mist rose, only the birds circled, only the blood remained. In the next chapter, we will follow those remains, the relics, the warnings, the limbs that traveled farther than he ever did, the head that looked upon one last man of faith, and the silence that followed him long after the fire had cooled. But before we go there, let us remember this. He was 23 years old, and his only crime was coming home. The body was no longer a body. Not in the way a soul once knew it. It had been undone, split into parts, rendered into silence, and scattered with purpose across a land that had once christened it in holy water. It was no longer Joseph Lampton who lay on the platform in that hidden corner of Newcastle. It was pieces of him, measured and sorted and packed for shipment like trophies or threats. Not to be mourned, but displayed. Not to be buried, but used. The law did not end with the execution. It continued in the display, in the lingering violence of limbs, nailed to gates and heads, impaled on spikes. A theater of cruelty meant to do what the rope and the blade could not, to keep the dead man speaking. Not in prayer, but in warning. They took the head first. Still warm, bloodless now, its features frozen in a calm that unsettled the men tasked with carrying it. Some say the lips were parted, as if mid-prayer or mid-breath. Some say the eyes had not fully closed, but no one lingered long enough to be sure. It was wrapped in cloth, bound tight, and taken from the site with the same urgency as a sealed document, to be presented to Father Edward Watterson, the second priest captured, the one who still lived, who still waited in his cell, whose faith had not yet been tested by fire. The guards brought it into his chamber without a word, unwrapped it slowly, held it before his eyes like a mirror turned inside out. They expected him to faint. They expected him to beg. They expected the sight of his friend's ruined face to break something inside him. But he did not flinch. He looked, and he bowed his head. To them, it was a severed head. To him, it was relic. They tried to frighten him with flesh, but he saw only grace. And so the message failed. The rest of the body was dealt with in haste. His arms and legs were quartered, each limb carried by horse or cart to towns that had not seen his face, to gates that did not know his name. One was hung in York, perhaps. One nailed to the southern gate of Durham. One brought eastward to the coast. Wherever they went, they arrived without explanation, just bone, tendon, muscle, hung from iron hooks, left to rot in the wind. Children saw them first. Often, street vendors, watchmen on early shift. No plaque, no record, only rumor, only whisper. Some spat, some crossed themselves, some simply looked away. But in the weeks that followed, something strange began to happen. The limbs did not horrify as they were meant to. They unsettled. Yes, but not with the fear of treason. With something else, something deeper. A sorrow that stuck in the throat. A question that could not be voiced aloud. Why so much pain for one man? Why such hatred for a priest who never carried a blade? And though the limbs grew black in the sun, though birds tore at the meat, though the nails rusted and the rain came, still they remained reminders, not of vengeance, but of silence, because no one knew what to say. And that, too, was part of the punishment. In towns where the parts were displayed, the clergy were warned not to speak of him, not in mass, not in letters, not in prayer. His name was not to be written, remembered, or spoken aloud. No sermons were allowed on martyrdom. No mention was to be made of his youth. And yet, the people remembered, not because they were told to, but because something in the story stayed, not in the records, in the marrow. The north of England had seen violence before. Rebellion, mass execution, the pilgrimage of grace, the rising of the earls. But this was different. This was not political. This was not war. This was a young man dragged through the streets, mutilated behind closed doors, and sent out in pieces not to teach a lesson, but to erase a soul. And the people, farmers, widows, beggars, children may not have known his sermons, may not have read his letters, may not have seen his ordination, but they understood something had been broken, and not by him. Word traveled slowly, but it did travel. A woman in York said she had seen the leg and wept without knowing why. A baker in Durham said the hand had been nailed near the market, and no one dared walk beneath it. A child in Newcastle asked her mother why the birds would not eat the heart. No one had answers, but the questions remained. The church remained silent. Officially, the bishops, under pressure from the crown, said nothing. Rome, cautious and distant, did not yet speak. But among the faithful in whisper, in coded letter, in locked confession, the memory of Joseph Lampton began to take shape. not as a rebel, not as a traitor, but as a boy who had been faithful unto death, a boy who had walked into fire and had not screamed, a boy who had been taken apart by the state, and still could not be forgotten. In time, those who remembered him began to call him the quiet martyr, not for how he died, but for how no one was allowed to mourn him. There was no shrine, no relic officially blessed, no pilgrimage, but in certain villages, people would lay flowers at the base of the gate where the hand once hung. In some households, mothers would name their sons Joseph, not because they knew the whole story, but because the name tasted like resistance. And in some places, years later, when the laws had softened and the gallows had gone quiet, a mass would be said quietly, at night, in Latin for a boy whose body had been broken, but whose name had not. In the next chapter, we will trace those whispers, the path of memory through a kingdom that tried to erase it. We will return to Edward Watterson, to the face of a priest who looked upon death and called it holy. We will follow the quiet spread of relics that were never recognized, but never forgotten. And we will hear the silence begin to turn not into shouts, not into rebellion, but into something more enduring belief. But before we go there, and let us remain, for just a moment longer, at the foot of the gate, let us stand beside the iron hook, still swaying slightly in the breeze. Let us look up, not to be shocked, but to remember, because even in pieces, he remained whole, and even torn apart, he was not alone. The limbs rotted, as limbs always do, and the wind tore at the fabric that once wrapped them, and the birds pecked until nothing was left but dark bone and darker silence. But Joseph Lampton had not vanished, not truly, not fully, not in the way the crown had intended, because in the shadows of the prisons, in the locked cells where the fire had not yet reached, one man still carried his name in his mouth like a prayer he dared not say aloud. And that man was Edward Watterson. He had watched them bring in the head. Still damp, still warm, still recognizable, as the boy he had stood beside in ordination. The friend he had laughed with in seminary courtyards. The young man who had crossed the sea with the same belief, the same mission, the same silent vow to serve a country that had already marked their names for death. They had brought the head into his cell, not as a mercy, not as a ritual of mourning, but as a weapon, a message wrapped in flesh, a warning built from blood. Look, they had said, this is what happens to your kind. This is what happens to those who refuse. And yet, when they unwrapped the cloth and placed it before him, Watterson had not flinched. He had bowed. He had made the sign of the cross. He had whispered a line of scripture, not in defiance, not in performance, but in reverence, because he did not see terror in that broken face. He saw consecration. And he knew in that moment that what they had tried to erase had only been transformed, that the boy who had died was not lost, only remade, not silenced, only sanctified. The guards had watched him with confusion. They had expected him to tremble, to scream, to collapse to his knees and beg for mercy. But what they saw instead was stillness, the kind of stillness that unnerves executioners more than any rebellion, the kind that belongs to saints, to stones, to those whose fear has already been burned away. And after they left, taking the head with them, the silence in the cell did not return to what it had been. Something had changed. Watterson no longer waited for reprieve. He no longer counted the days or listened for footsteps. He only prayed, slowly, rhythmically, without hope of escape, but with the quiet certainty that if the fire came for him too, it would find him ready. The officials still hoped he might recant. They gave him more time than they had given Joseph. They sent priests of the new church to speak with him, to offer him clemency if he would only take the oath of supremacy, if he would only deny Rome, if he would only bend his knee to the crown. But for every argument, every appeal, every sermon wrapped in threat, Watterson offered the same answer: silence. Not refusal, not debate, only silence. And it was this silence that frightened them more than any speech, because the dead could be quartered, burned, scattered, but the living could still become dangerous. If they died well, they delayed his execution for weeks, hoping that solitude might wear him down, that the weight of Joseph's death might finally crack the edge of his resolve. But what they did not understand was that Joseph had not broken him. Joseph had prepared him. Every lash, every splintered limb, every burned organ had been an anointing, a last rite delivered not in oil but in flame. And now, Watterson did not walk alone. He carried the image of that final sacrifice inside him, and it gave him the kind of strength that the law could not account for. When his execution was finally set, there were some who still hoped he would change his mind. But on the morning of his death, he asked for nothing. No food, no priest, no last letter. He walked to the gallows with eyes open. And as he climbed the scaffold, those who watched him later said that he did not look down once, only forward, as if he were walking towards something he had long expected, as if the rope and the blade were not punishment, but confirmation. He died the same way Joseph had broken by the law, mutilated by the sentence, sanctified by the silence that followed. And though they scattered his body too, though they tried to erase him as they had erased the other, what remained was not flesh, but story. And story, once whispered in the right ears, cannot be unwhispered. Across the north, the tale spread, not in official channels, not in books, but in kitchens, in barns, in narrow paths between fields, where old women still said the rosary with their fingers hidden in their aprons, and young boys were told not fairy tales before bed, but stories of men who had died rather than deny the Mass. Joseph Lampton, Edward Watterson, the quiet martyrs. They became names, not of resistance, but of resilience, names spoken when the world felt cruel, when faith felt dangerous, when silence felt like the only shield. And in time, those whispers grew roots. They reached the ears of traveling priests in disguise. They reached the sons of those who had watched the heads swing on the gates. They reached England's enemies and her exiles, who copied the stories into letters and journals and passed them between seminaries and hidden churches like sacred relics. In Rome, eventually, their names surfaced in documents sent from the English mission, and though years would pass, and decades, and centuries would sweep clean the blood from the scaffold, the memory remained. And in the year 1987, when the Pope gathered the names of the 85 martyrs of England and Wales, Joseph Lampton was among them, his death no longer recorded as crime, but as witness, no longer as treason, but as testimony. But long before Rome declared it, the faithful had already known, because even without relics, even without graves, even without hymns, they had remembered. They had remembered the face brought into the cell, the limbs nailed to the gate, the priest who would not kneel, the rope that did not silence him, the fire that failed to burn his name from their mouths. And so, the execution that had been meant to frighten a city had instead awakened a country, not all at once, not with torches, but quietly, patiently, with prayers spoken beneath breath, with names carved into the edges of pews, with eyes lifted not toward the throne, but toward the gallows. In the next chapter, we will return to those gates. Now, empty of limbs, but heavy with memory. We will follow the path of relics that never were, and the churches that would not speak, and the voices that did not scream, but whispered across centuries until even the silence could no longer deny what had happened. But before we go there, let us stay for a moment longer in the stillness of the cell, where two men once waited, one who died before dawn, and one who died after seeing what fire can do when it does not succeed in killing what it burns. Because in that stillness, something holy began, not in light, but in the dark. There are doors that never open again after an execution, not because they are sealed with law or bricked over in fear, but because something invisible lingers in the wood, something not quite seen but always felt. And in the years after the scaffold in Newcastle fell silent, there were churches whose side chapels were left locked even during high feast days. There were corridors and seminaries where the light burned longer than it should have, and no one asked why. There were corners of England where the air grew colder without warning. And it was not the gallows that haunted those places, but the memory of a priest who died before most men begin to live. A boy, dragged through stone streets, and quartered not for murder or treason in the way most men understand it, but for praying in Latin and refusing to say that a crown sat above God. It was not just his body that had been divided and scattered. It was the memory of him, broken into parts, sent to different towns, spoken of only in fragments, a hand here, a jawbone there, a name whispered in the north, and then lost again before it could take root. And yet, despite the crown's best efforts to erase him, Joseph Lampton did not vanish. He became something more difficult to contain. He became a silence that would not stay quiet. He became the pause in the voice of a young curate who hesitated before reciting the name of Elizabeth Regina in the Book of Common Prayer. He became the shadow in the margins of family Bibles, where a date had been circled and no one could remember why. He became the look between two widows at Mass who remembered a boy who once knelt and wept during confession and never returned. The church itself, bent under pressure from the state, said nothing. The bishops, and fearful of losing what little ground they had left, refused to name him. The chapels that had once taken in traveling priests refused to take any more. And the nuns, who had once embroidered secret prayers into the hems of their habits, and began instead to pull the thread loose and cast it into fire. But not all forgot. Not every altar turned its face away. There were still those who remembered, not because they had been told, but because they had seen, because they had smelled the smoke from the surgeon's fire, because they had felt the tremble of the rope as it pulled, then gave way, then pulled again. In Newcastle, the scaffold was taken down before midday. The blood was scrubbed from the boards, the gallows dismantled and repurposed, the wood reused for carts or crates or fences. But in the earth, the stain remained. Dogs refused to walk across it. Children said the grass never grew back right. And for many years, the locals referred to that patch of ground not by any official name, but only as the Monday Place, as if even saying the word execution was too heavy for the mouth. And in that name, carried from lips to ears for generations, the ghost of what had happened there survived, not in rebellion, not in fire, but in the quiet endurance of those who would not pretend the silence was clean. The gate where his limb had been nailed, too, became a site of unease. Travelers passing through the city would slow as they approached it, not knowing why. Some swore the wind changed near it. Others said the wood creaked more than it should have, even when the air was still. And there were stories, years later, of a boy who climbed the gate on a dare and fell, not from height, but from fear, claiming he had seen a figure kneeling beside the stone, whispering a prayer that no one else could hear. The city authorities, uncomfortable with these stories but unwilling to acknowledge them, eventually replaced the gate entirely, tearing it down in the dead of night and building a new one of clean timber and iron. But still, the street beneath it never quite forgot. In the homes of the faithful, the memory lived on differently. There were no portraits. There were no relics, at least none recognized by Rome. But there were habits small, strange, persistent. In one household, the youngest child was always baptized with water taken from a specific well, and no one could remember who had started the tradition. In another, a scrap of black cloth was passed from grandmother to daughter to granddaughter, folded and refolded, and never explained. And in many homes, especially in Durham and its edges, the night before the feast of St. Joseph was always kept with candles, but no one ever said whose name the candles were for. And it was not just the Catholics who remembered in time. Even those who had stood on the other side of the law began to speak differently. A constable in his old age confessed to a curate that he had watched the execution and had never slept through the night since. A judge's grandson found a letter in his grandfather's hand, never sent, admitting that the sentence had been passed too quickly, that the boy had not even spoken in his own defense. And there were whispers among the jailers that the cell where Joseph had been kept was colder than the others, even in high summer. Even when the sun beat down on the roof so fiercely that the slates cracked and the mortar steamed. But there were no uprisings, no riots, no public monuments. England did not rise in rebellion for a single priest, no matter how unjust his death. The years rolled forward. Elizabeth reigned another decade. More priests died. More limbs were scattered. More heads were boiled and dipped in pitch and displayed above bridges until the birds hollowed out their eyes and the wind carried their names away. But still, Joseph Lampton endured not because history insisted on remembering him, but because forgetting him never quite succeeded. In the next chapter, we will leave the gates and the gallows behind and follow instead the shadow his name cast forward through time into hidden masses, into beatification centuries later, into the quiet places where holiness still whispers through stone. We will return to the idea of relics, not the bone and blood that the Church blesses, but the fragments of story that make a man a saint in the mouths of the poor, long before Rome ever lifts a pen. But before we go there, let us pause here. In this place where the silence grew thick and the memory refused to vanish, let us stand beside the door that no one opens, the stone that no one walks across, the name that no one writes but everyone seems to know. Because some stories are too quiet to echo, but too true to disappear. And Joseph Lampton's was one of them. The centuries did what centuries always do. They buried what was too dangerous to say aloud, wrapped it in time, dust, and forgetfulness, and the trembling deference people show when they speak of holy things without names. But the memory of Joseph Lampton did not rot like the flesh they had once burned, and his story did not die, as his body had in pieces, in fire, in dark corners of the kingdom, where no mass was said. Instead, it took root in the very soil that had once tried to deny him. It grew not in monuments or cathedrals or canon law, but in gestures too small to record, in a kind of shared silence, passed from hand to hand like contraband grace. in which the name of a boy who had been dragged across stone streets for refusing to deny his church was spoken not with ceremony, but with longing, the kind of longing that only grows in the spaces where justice once failed. There was a town in the north, not far from Durham, where people left rosemary on a certain field every year on the 31st of July. Though no one could say how the custom had started, the old women said it was for the harvest, that the scent kept the ground strong. The children said it was for a ghost. But there was always someone who lit a candle that night, placed it in a window, let it burn low without prayer, without explanation, and there were records faded, fragile, of a priest, long gone, of a young man who had died early on a Monday morning when the air still tasted of dew and smoke. But they were never read aloud, never discussed. They were kept in drawers, in the backs of sacristies, tucked inside the covers of old Bibles, next to pages so worn with kissing they had grown thin as lace. He had never been given relics, not officially, not by Rome, but the people made their own. A scrap of rope found in a Newcastle cellar was passed between 3 generations of a family who said it was from the scaffold, though no one could prove it. A square of charred wood, claimed to be from the stake where his organs had been burned, was carved into a rosary bead and carried across the channel by a sailor who never returned. In one convent in Belgium, a sealed letter from a nun named Agnes spoke of a lock of hair, black, brittle, taken before the body was quartered, kept hidden in a scrap of linen marked with a cross of blood, and buried inside the foundation stone of the chapel where she prayed for him every year until her death. They did not need canonization. They did not wait for a declaration from the Vatican. They already believed. But belief does not always survive history. And as England changed, as new rulers rose, as old altars fell, as the faces on the coins changed and the laws bent in new directions, the memory of Joseph Lampton thinned. It never vanished, but it sank below the surface, like a river running beneath frost. Waiting. It waited through the fire of the Stuarts, through the exile of the faithful, through the slow return of the Mass in dark rooms and unmarked houses. It waited while the priests came back, this time with better disguises, better hiding places. The old ways taught in whispers, and passed in Latin, between hands that trembled from age. Not fear. It waited as Rome began to take notice again slowly, cautiously gathering the names of those who had died centuries before without trials, without rites, without stones, to mark where they lay. And then came the modern world, with its libraries and archives and historians who no longer burned what they found. It was not piety that saved him. It was paper. Somewhere in the offices of the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, someone opened a file, copied a name, followed a trail of letters, witness reports, burial records, execution accounts. It was not the fire of the scaffold, but the ink of archivists that brought him forward again. The story had always been there, hidden. But there, in the year 1987, Pope John Paul II beatified 85 martyrs of England and Wales, men and women who had died for their faith during the Reformation. Their names stitched together from centuries of silence. Among them Joseph Lampton. No title, no fanfare, just the confirmation of what the poor had already known, that he had died not as a traitor, but as a servant, that his body had been broken not by justice, but by fear, that his silence had been the loudest kind of witness. The beatification was simple, a mass, a list of names read aloud, the usual ritual. But in Newcastle, Durham, York, In the north, where the ground still knew what had been spilled into it, the bells rang without being asked. People lit candles who had not set foot in churches in years. A letter was read in a school where his name had never been taught. And one child asked why no one had ever told them that saints had died here too. And now the field in the north, the one where rosemary had been left each year, by hands that did not know why now that field was no longer just soil. It was memory. It was pilgrimage. Not official. Not announced. But real. Every year, someone new came. A priest. A student. A woman with a name written on parchment, handed down from her grandmother, who said, "Keep this. It is holy." They brought no banners. They brought no relics. They brought only themselves and silence, because in the end, his story was never about glory. It was about a refusal, about a boy who said no when the world demanded yes, about a rope that did not break him, about a blade that did not scatter him, about a kingdom that tried to make his death a secret and failed. In the final chapter, we will return to the field, to the memory, to the breath between executions and resurrection. We will follow the last trace of Joseph Lampton's voice, not in prayer, not in protest, but in the stillness that comes when a kingdom has done all it can to kill someone and still cannot make them disappear. But before we go there, let us linger here in this quiet, postscript century, where the world has grown louder, but the story has grown deeper. Let us stand where they once knelt. Let us say no words. Let us light no fire. Let us only listen, because the boy who was hanged in secret now lives in every silence the church still keeps sacred. And the man who quartered him is gone. But Joseph Lampton remains. The story does not end at the scaffold, nor at the fire, nor at the scattered limbs nailed to the gates of cities that have long since forgotten what passed beneath their arches. It does not end at the beatification, nor at the naming of martyrs in the marble halls of Rome, nor in the old scrolls inked by trembling hands centuries after the fact. It ends here, in the quiet, in the last breath before sleep, in the place where memory is not recited, but felt in the stillness of a heart that holds something it cannot name but refuses to let go, because Joseph Lampton never truly died the way they wanted him to, and the punishment they designed to erase him only scattered him wider, not only in body, but in meaning, so that no town could fully claim him. No cathedral could solely house him. No grave could hold him, and no silence could bury him. It became a question, a ghost without malice, a name without monument. He became the cold spot in the archives, where historians paused without knowing why. He became the uncertain pause in the voice of the priest who read the names of the martyrs and hesitated before reaching his. He became the breath caught in the throat of a child who lit a candle and did not know what to pray. Only that something holy had once burned in silence. And in that way, he never stopped walking the northern roads, never stopped entering through locked doors, never stopped kneeling beside the beds of the dying who had been told God had no use for the Latin tongue. He became the proof that a kingdom could pass judgment, but not erase grace. That a rope could strangle breath, but not memory. That fire could break flesh, but not undo what had already been sealed in heaven. In the years after his beatification, there were petitions made for a shrine, for a mass in his name, for a statue or a tablet or even a plaque in one of the churches where he might have served, had he lived past 23. But nothing grand was ever built. Perhaps that was right. Perhaps Joseph Lampton, whose death had been hidden, whose body had been split and burned and nailed to wood in secret, he belonged to the earth more than to the stone. Perhaps it was better that he remained among the whisperers, the field sowers, the ones who believed without permission. Perhaps sainthood, for him, was not about gold leaf icons or stained glass windows, but about the way strangers bowed their heads when passing through Durham without knowing they were doing it. About the woman who kept a candle lit in her kitchen every Monday morning without telling her children why. About the boy in seminary who read about him in a footnote and could not stop thinking of how quiet he had been when they hanged him, because in a time when saints were made with swords, Joseph brought nothing but silence. He did not preach. He did not argue. He did not condemn. He simply refused. He refused to swear what he did not believe. He refused to call Elizabeth the head of the church. He refused to betray the orders he had taken in a French basilica, barely 2 months before his death. And when they came for him with rope, with fire, with blade, he did not resist. But neither did he bend. That was what made him dangerous. That was what made him unforgettable. That was what turned a Monday morning into a memory that would not burn clean. There are places, still corners of churches, back roads near Newcastle, quiet cemeteries in the north, where his story hangs in the air like smoke. No one says his name, but they remember him. They remember the priest who died too young, too quiet, too soon. They remember the man who was hanged, drawn, and quartered not in public, not with crowds, but behind walls, at dawn, out of fear that people might care. And they remember the crown that feared not war, but witness, because that is what Joseph became, a witness, not to rebellion, not to doctrine, but to fidelity, to the stubborn, heartbreaking beauty of remaining true, even when the truth costs you everything. His life was short. His words were few. His end was brutal, but what he left behind was a kind of courage that does not shout, does not shine, does not win battles. But en dur, in secret, in the cold, in the dark, and now, centuries later, we remember him not because we are told to, but because we cannot help it. We remember him because there is something in us that leans toward the light, even when it is hidden behind closed chapel doors. We remember him because the quietest deaths sometimes leave the loudest echoes. We remember him because there are parts of the soul that still answer to the name of someone who gave his last breath to something eternal. So now the tale ends. Not with a sword. Not with a trumpet. Not with a line drawn in blood. But with this, a single flame lit in your imagination. A single step taken across a field where he once walked. A single breath drawn and held in silence, the way he might have held his own just before the rope was pulled, because Joseph Lampton was not made holy by how he died. He was made holy by how he never stopped believing, and in that, he lives still, not in pieces, but in full, not in pain, but in peace. And now, as sleep approaches and the world grows quiet once more, his story, like the last echo of a church bell rung too long ago, fades not into forgetting, but into remembrance. He is gone, but not lost, never lost.